Okay, so today I want to get you prepared for the paper that you're going to write for this class. And the directions are here up on Blackboard, and I hope you've had a chance to take a look at them. What we're trying to do is to test whether Renee Romano's interpretation of the popular memory of the civil rights movement, which she lays out in that book chapter that I had you read, we're trying to figure out if her claims about the popular memory of the civil rights movement fit with Mississippi Burning. Okay? And so what I'm asking you to do here is answer this question, right? Does Mississippi Burning challenge or support Romano's argument about the popular memory of the civil rights movement? And I have a pretty detailed organizational scheme here that I think works best when people write this paper. But before we get into that, I think we really need to make sure that we understand what Romano's interpretation of the popular memory of the civil rights movement is before we really get into these sections. So I'm going to bring this down here, and I'm going to bring up the PDF of the book chapter that I had you read by Renee Romano. And if you found this, this chapter difficult, don't worry about it. We're going to go through it. This is it's meant to be a challenging reading. It's the most challenging thing that we'll read in this class. And so I want to point you to the really important parts here, because she's using a trial that's happening, trying to prosecute someone for a civil rights crime long after the fact, and she's trying to bring out some of these themes that are here that speak to these problematic ways that we remember the civil rights movement. And we're basically going to take those arguments she has, those claims that she has about the memory of the civil rights movement, and see whether they actually fit Mississippi Burning. Because she's trying to use this trial to say that, to not just make claims about the trial, but also to make claims just more generally about how we remember it. Okay? And so if you go to page 3 of the PDF document, okay, on the right side, and so this is page 3 of the PDF, page 99 of the actual book chapter here. Okay, she lays out what she calls the trial narrative, and that's what we're using here. This is her explanation of what she thinks the popular memory of the civil rights movement looks like. It's what she calls the facets of the trial narrative. Okay, and so the first thing that we're looking for, okay, when we're watching Mississippi Burning, the first way we're going to test this is we're going to see if the movie portrays, as she says here, whites as heroes and blacks as long-suffering victims. Okay, and she says, like many civil rights films and dramas, they downplay the importance and even the existence of black activism while offering images of whites who are committed to racial justice. Okay, and so let's look at this. So if the film supports Romano's interpretation of the popular memory of the civil rights movement, then in Mississippi Burning, what you're going to see is that the heroes in this film are whites, right? And African Americans are very passive in the film. There's not going to be really any portrayals of black activism in the film. It's really going to be African Americans portrayed as victims of racism, and there are going to be some white people who emerge as the heroes of this film, basically standing up for African Americans. Okay, so that's the first piece here of her argument that we're going to test in the film. All right. The second piece is the most difficult piece to actually test, so let's spend some time on this. So she says, second, okay, the trials, so in this case we're substituting trials for the film. So second, the film would pit these heroes against individual evil racists, portraying the men who bombed the church. So in the film, we're talking about the people who are committing whatever acts of violence that are in the film as personally responsible for racial hatred of the South while ignoring the larger culture of racism of the time. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. Let's break it down into two pieces. So number one, what we're looking for in the film when we're looking at who are the sort of racists, who are the evil people in Mississippi Burning when we're watching it. Okay, if it fits Romano's interpretation, then number one, it's just kind of a few white people who are doing these really heinous acts. Okay, that's what we're looking for if it fits her interpretation. The second piece of this, she says that, which is right here, she says that popular memory ignores the larger culture of racism. Okay, that's the more important, more difficult piece of this. And so to find that, we actually have to go, I'm going to go down here to page 12 of the PDF document. And it's over here on the left side. That gives us a better sense of what she means by the culture of racism. And so she explains it right here on the left side. It depicts these three men, primarily as lone virulent racists, that she's talking about the trial here, not as part of a larger terrorist apparatus. And this is what she's talking about in terms of the culture of racism that was used to maintain segregation in the South, right? And so it says that it ignores how politicians, the police, the city fathers, we're talking about businessmen, might share some burden of the responsibility of this racism. Okay, so the second piece we're thinking about here, if Romano is right, okay, if her interpretation is correct, then it ignores the culture of racism. All right, and so what the film would ignore are these really powerful people in the community who are contributing to this racism. So it would ignore the role of the police in contributing to the heinous acts that are in the film. It would ignore the city fathers, who we often think about as business people. So let's think about that as business people. So it would ignore the role of business people in the community who contribute to these heinous acts. It would ignore the role of politicians in the community who contribute to these heinous acts. So again, if she's right in her interpretation, then the people who are committing these evil acts of racism are just kind of a few white people in the South, and the film would ignore the role of the police, business people, and politicians in these heinous acts. If she's wrong, right, if we're going to end up, if you see in the film that it's not just the work of a couple of really nasty white people, and it also includes, the film portrays police, politicians, and business people who are contributing to this sort of violence and heinous acts, then you would say that she's wrong about the second facet here, okay? All right, so then the final piece, because we're testing three pieces here. So right on the bottom of the page 3 of the PDF, we're back there. It says, finally, the trials tell a critical story about how much the nation has, we'll go to the next page, how much the nation has changed since the civil rights era. Okay, and so what are we looking at there in the film? What we're trying to look for is whether the film is trying to show the viewer a story of progress, of a story about things getting better. And so the way to test that is to think about how the movie ends. And so if throughout most of the movie, this is a movie about really heinous racism, but at the end of the movie, there's some sort of resolution, and there's this message that things are actually getting better, right? Then it would fit Romano's interpretation, right? That this being sort of kind of a celebration of the progress of the civil rights movement. If instead you see in the film, a really nasty, heinous acts all throughout the film, and things don't get any better by the end, then that would challenge her interpretation, perhaps. Okay, and so those are the three things that we're looking for, that we're testing. Okay, whether the film fits with all three parts of this, what she calls the trial narrative, right? That's her interpretation of how we remember the civil rights movement, what the popular memory of the civil rights movement looks like, okay? So again, we're testing whether Mississippi Burning portrays whites as heroes and blacks as long-suffering victims, okay? Second, we're testing whether Mississippi Burning focuses on a few individual races producing heinous acts and ignores the culture of racism. And then finally, we're testing whether Mississippi Burning tells a story about how much the nation has changed, whether it tells a story of progress. What's really important here is that you don't have to agree or disagree with all three parts of her what she calls the trial narrative. You could, for example, say, while Romano's first facet of the trial narrative is correct, the second and third aren't represented in Mississippi Burning. Okay, so you do not. It's not an all or nothing sort of paper. Okay, you can identify which facets of this trial narrative are correct and which facets are wrong. Or if you end up agreeing with all three or disagreeing with all three, that's fine too. But you don't have to do an all or nothing sort of paper here. Okay, now let's get back to the paper directions. Okay, so again, what we're asking here is, does Mississippi Burning challenge or support Romano's argument about the popular memory of the civil rights movement? And this is how I want the paper to be broken down. So we start with an introduction, okay? And so this is where you introduce the paper and state your argument. And this is what's really important. You can lose really easy points by not making an argument. And the argument is really simple here. Basically, you're stating, it's basically you're answering the question that I just read, okay? And so an argument might look like this. Renee Romano, Mississippi Burning supports all three facets of Romano's trial narrative. Okay, or another argument might be that Mississippi Burning supports the first and the third facet of Romano's trial narrative, but not the second. Okay, that is your argument. Your argument is the answer to that question. Do not leave that out. All right, you lose easy points. Okay, there has to be an argument in this introduction. I can't emphasize that enough, and you won't believe how many papers forget to put that in, okay? Make sure it is in the paper. Now, the next section here is just Romano's interpretation. And here is, I just want you to summarize all three pieces of the trial narrative, okay? Pretty simple, so it should be 1 to 2 paragraphs long. Now, the next section, this is the crux of your paper, okay? This is where you analyze the film and give me evidence to support your argument, right? And so you need to analyze all three pieces of Romano's argument and whether Mississippi Burning fits all three, okay? And so what I say here is that this should be 3 to 4 pages long, right? And so let's say, for example, that you think that Mississippi Burning supports the first facet of Romano's argument, that it portrays whites as heroes and African Americans as passive victims, and they really don't show up as activists in this film. Okay, so then you would start this section titled Mississippi Burning here, stating that part of the argument, right, that you agree with the first facet, and giving me scenes from the film that show how whites are the heroes and blacks are passive victims, right? Pick out specific scenes and tell me how this particular scene shows whites as the heroes, right? Show me how this particular scene portrays African Americans as passive victims. All right, bring out as many scenes as you can to support each piece of your argument. Right? Then you would move on to the second facet of Romano's argument. And let's say that you don't agree with Romano's second facet. Let's say you argue that the culture of racism is present in the film, right? And so in that section, you'd give me a bunch of scenes where, the police, where business people, where politicians, right, are contributing to the racism in the film, and it's not just a bunch of individual white racists, right? Then you would move to the third facet of the film, which is whether this film tells a story of progress, right? And let's say you agree with that part of the film, that it does tell a story of progress. Well, give me scenes that show that this film starts as focusing on a bunch of heinous racist acts, and then at the end it moves to a different sort of story, a reconciliation, a celebration. And so give me a bunch of scenes that show that, right? Basically, we're just mobilizing evidence to support our particular argument here. And then finally, you end with a concluding paragraph, okay? Now, it's due by August 1st by 11:59. It'll be due on Blackboard, and there'll be a link for you to submit the paper. Some really basic rules here that I'm looking for. So 12-point font, all right, double spaced. No citations are necessary here. You're only using the film and the book chapter. I really want you to focus on your analytical skills here and not necessarily your citation skills. So no citations necessary, no footnotes, no endnotes, no bibliography necessary. All right, 1-inch margins. And another thing, feel free to use the section titles as subheadings in your paper, right? These, Romano's interpretation, Mississippi burning, conclusion. If you want to use those to break up your paper with subheadings, feel free. All right, the required length is 4 to 6 pages. No cover page necessary. Then I have a pretty clear grading rubric here. Strong and clear argument, 15 points. That's why I put so much emphasis on it just a minute ago. If you don't have an argument there, you lose 15 easy points, right? That next section where you just summarize the 3 facets of Romano's trial narrative, 10 points. The bulk of this paper, right, is 50 points where you provide the evidence to support your argument. And then finally, 25 points on writing style. And I should show you here exactly what we're looking for. Don't use passive voice. Don't quote when you can paraphrase. And a really good rule of thumb here is that don't use more than 1 quote per paragraph. Okay, I want this paper to be in your own words. Remember that quotations are really lazy writing. Only use them when it's absolutely necessary. I don't want to see anywhere, I believe, in my opinion, I feel, I think, any of those sorts of statements that suggest that you're not sure about the claim that you're making. I want to get those out of your writing. I want you, when you start revising, okay, and I hope that there is an actual revision here, that you have a rough draft and a final draft, and you don't send this to me, send the first draft to me. I want you to look for how many times you use the verb to be, which is, is, was, were. And the reason why we want to try to get those out of our writing is because it is really the weakest verb in the English language, and it makes your writing worse. And it can the sentence can almost always be rewritten by taking to be out and putting in a stronger verb. Okay, and that's one of the things I want you to work on here in this paper. Another thing that we'll look for are these long, clumsy sentences. All right, work on writing short, crisp, clear sentences. One of the biggest mistakes that undergraduates make is that they think long sentences make them look smarter, right? But short, crisp sentences make you look smarter. And so try to work on that. Try to look at those, get those sentences that have a bunch of commas and clauses in them. Try to break those up into 2, even 3 sentences. And then finally, is kind of an obvious one, don't write unreadable sentences that suggest you didn't undertake any revisions. All right. If you have any questions, this is supposed to be a challenging paper. It's not supposed to be easy. If you have any questions, email me, and we can correspond over email, or we can set up a phone call or something too to further clarify what you need to do in this paper.